What would you do if a simple mistake on a plane led to you losing everything? A black woman is kicked off a flight, humiliated by a racist flight attendant, but what happens next will shock you. A year later, she's not just fighting for justice. She's taking down an entire airline's dirty secrets. Stick around, because this story isn't just about revenge. It's about exposing a hidden truth that could change the way we all see the world. Sasha Johnson had always prided herself on being different. She wasn't just another woman in a corporate job. She was the woman who defied the odds. A successful marketing executive for one of the biggest airlines in the country, she had climbed the ladder with grace, intelligence, and the quiet determination that came with knowing her worth. But even at the peak of her success, Sasha couldn't escape the subtle whispers of racism that followed her wherever she went. It was the small things, the comments about her hair, the way people questioned her authority, the polite but dismissive gestures that told her she was always an outsider, no matter how much she achieved. That morning, Sasha was on a flight to a major business conference, one she'd worked tirelessly for. It was the kind of high-stakes meeting that could change the trajectory of her career. She boarded the plane with confidence, her black leather briefcase in hand, her black dress sharp and perfectly tailored. As she walked down the aisle to her seat in business class, she noticed the usual stares. She had learned to ignore them over the years. White passengers who looked up at her, some puzzled, some surprised, others just indifferent. But Sasha wasn't bothered by it today. She was focused. She was ready. She took her seat by the window, settled in, and pulled out her phone to review her notes. The flight was supposed to be an ordinary one, a few hours in the air, then a conference, then back to work. But she hadn't even begun to relax when a voice interrupted her. "Excuse me, miss. I'm going to have to ask you to move." Sasha looked up, a little startled but not immediately worried. Perhaps the attendant had mistaken her seat assignment. The woman standing at her side was in uniform, a flight attendant, looking down at her with a practiced smile. But Sasha could tell something was off. The way the woman's eyes darted between the seat and her, the tightness in her smile, the tone of her voice. It wasn't right. "I'm sorry, what?" Sasha replied, her brow furrowing slightly. The flight attendant, who introduced herself as Megan, smiled again, but there was an edge to her voice now. "This is business class. I'm afraid you don't belong here. You'll need to move to economy." Sasha blinked in surprise. "I'm sorry. I think there's been a mistake. I'm in the right seat. My ticket was upgraded." Megan's eyes narrowed, and she glanced down at the seat next to Sasha, then back at her. "I don't think so. You're not supposed to be here." There was a pause, then Megan added, almost dismissively, "You're just not the kind of person we usually see up here." Sasha's stomach twisted. The words stung more than she expected. She had dealt with discrimination before, those little moments when people questioned her intelligence or assumed she wasn't qualified. But this felt different. This wasn't a small remark. This was blatant. And it was happening in front of a full cabin of passengers. Before Sasha could respond, Megan's tone shifted again, more insistent this time. "I'm going to need you to leave. Now." She gestured toward the aisle. "Please, move. We don't want to cause a scene." The humiliation hit Sasha hard. She looked around, searching for support. Some passengers had turned to look, their eyes wide, others glancing away awkwardly, pretending not to notice. There were no allies, no voices rising in her defense, just the cold, clinical professionalism of Megan, whose smile had now turned into a thin, almost mocking line. Sasha's heart pounded in her chest. She stood up slowly, a mix of disbelief and anger building inside her. How was this even happening? She had been flying with this airline for years, always polite, always on time, always paying full price. She had never once caused a problem. But here she was, forced to stand in front of a full cabin, her dignity stripped away, as a woman twice her size told her to go back to where she came from. "I'm not moving," Sasha said, her voice low but firm, her anger finally bubbling to the surface. "You don't get to tell me where I belong." Megan's eyes flashed with irritation. "I don't have time for this, miss. You're going to cause a scene if you don't move right now. I'm asking you nicely." She took a step forward, trying to block Sasha's view of the rest of the cabin. Sasha could feel her pulse in her throat. She wasn't sure where the courage was coming from, but it was there. She wasn't going to back down. Not this time. "I'm not going anywhere," Sasha repeated, her voice steady but strong. The silence in the cabin deepened. Some passengers shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable, but no one spoke up. Megan's eyes flicked to the flight deck and back to Sasha. The tension between them hung thick in the air. For a moment, it felt like the world had stopped, and it was just the two of them, locked in a standoff. Without another word, Megan turned and walked away, but not without a parting shot. "We'll see about this," she said, her voice cold. Sasha stood there for a long moment, her body trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. The cabin felt smaller now. Every eye was on her, but no one said anything. She wanted to scream, to confront the people who had allowed this to happen, but instead, she stood frozen, her mind racing. The rest of the flight went by in a blur. Megan didn't return to speak to her again, but the damage had already been done. Sasha couldn't focus on the business meeting she was supposed to be preparing for. She couldn't shake the feeling that something had broken in her, that a line had been crossed. By the time the plane landed, Sasha's chest was tight with anger and humiliation. She had been kicked off her own seat. She had been told she didn't belong. She had been made to feel small, invisible, and that would stay with her long after the flight had ended. As she stepped off the plane, she didn't know it yet, but her life was about to change forever. This moment, this humiliation, was the spark that would ignite a fire in her, a fire that would push her to take on the very system that had put her in that seat in the first place. And though she didn't realize it yet, the fight for justice had only just begun. The days following the flight incident felt like a haze to Sasha. The humiliation still stung, and every time she closed her eyes, she could see the image of Megan standing over her, that condescending look in her eyes. The words replayed in her mind like a broken record. "You don't belong here." No matter how hard she tried to shake it off, the anger simmered beneath the surface. It wasn't just the flight attendant's words, it was the entire system that allowed this to happen. The airline hadn't even offered an apology. Instead, they did what corporations did best, brush it under the rug, hoping it would fade from public view. Sasha's phone was buzzing constantly. She had always been active on social media, but now the notifications were relentless. Her post about the incident, meant to explain what had happened, had gone viral. People were outraged. Some supported her completely, others claimed she was exaggerating. The comments ranged from outrage to dismissiveness, and Sasha found herself constantly scrolling through the influx of messages, most of them from strangers, some from former colleagues who were equally furious. The media caught wind of the story too. Headlines like "Racial Incident on Airline Leaves Passenger Humiliated" and "Woman Kicked Off First-Class Seat for Not Belonging" splashed across every outlet. Sasha had become a symbol of the fight against racism, but not the way she had imagined. She hadn't asked for this attention, this spotlight. It was hard enough navigating her professional life without adding public outrage to the mix. Her colleagues at the airline seemed hesitant to reach out. Sasha had worked hard to build relationships with some of the senior staff, but now they were distant, avoiding eye contact when they saw her at company events or even in the hallways. It was as if they feared her presence. They didn't know what to say, how to handle it. Most of them chose to remain silent, and that hurt more than anything. She had been the one to always champion diversity, always raised her voice for those who didn't have one. But in this moment, where was the support? Why were they letting this happen to her? At home, Sasha sank deeper into her own mind. Her apartment felt smaller somehow, the walls closing in as she paced from room to room, staring at the news articles, the countless messages. She had always been the strong one, the go-getter, the woman who took everything in stride. But now, she wasn't sure what to do with all this rage inside her. Every time she went to bed, she couldn't sleep, her mind racing, wondering why people thought it was okay to treat her this way. She wanted answers, and she wanted them fast, but the airline seemed content to sit on their hands and hope it would all go away. Sasha's best friend, Kara, tried to help. Kara was a lawyer, smart, fiery, and never one to back down from a fight. The two of them had grown up together, always in each other's corner. Kara kept calling, checking in, offering advice. But Sasha wasn't sure how to explain the depth of what she was feeling. It wasn't just about the seat on the plane. It was about the years of frustration, the constant feeling that no matter how far she rose in her career, there would always be that invisible ceiling, that glass wall. The airline wasn't just a job to her. It was supposed to be a place where she could thrive, but now she felt betrayed by it. "I'm sorry, Sasha," Kara said one night as they sat in Sasha's living room, wine glasses in hand. "I know it's not easy, but this isn't just about what happened on the plane, right? This is about everything you've had to face to get here. You've been dealing with this for years, haven't you?" Sasha sighed, leaning back on the couch, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass. She didn't want to admit it, but Kara was right. She had been dealing with this for years, quietly, silently, pushing through it because she had no other choice. But this time, something was different. This time, it was personal. The rage had become too much to ignore. "I don't know what to do anymore, Kara. I've been working my ass off to get to this point. I've been doing everything they wanted, playing the game, following the rules. But it's never enough. It never will be." Sasha's voice cracked, her frustration seeping through. "And then this happens. The airline doesn't even care, they just want it to go away." Kara sat up straighter, her eyes narrowing. "You can't let them get away with this. You can't just let it slide, Sasha. You've got a voice, and it's powerful. People are listening to you now. Do something with that. Make them listen. Not just to you, but to everyone who's been silenced by this kind of crap for years." Sasha looked at her best friend, the fire in Kara's eyes igniting something in her that she hadn't realized was there. She had always been the type to push back when necessary, to fight for what was right. But the thought of standing up to the airline, of taking on the system that had allowed her humiliation to happen, felt overwhelming. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone else who had been treated like this and had no voice. But as Sasha thought about it, the anger inside her began to shift. Maybe this was the moment to do something bigger. Maybe it wasn't about getting an apology from the airline. Maybe it was about pushing for real change. Maybe it was time to start a conversation the airline didn't want to have. "I'm not going to let them off the hook," Sasha finally said, her voice firm. "I'm going to make them listen. I'm going to make them change. But I can't do it alone. I need to get people on my side." Kara grinned, her expression fierce. "Now you're talking." Sasha took a deep breath, feeling the weight of what she was about to do settle over her. She didn't know exactly where this path would take her, but for the first time in days, she felt something like hope. It was time to fight back. Not just for herself, but for everyone who had been told they didn't belong. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was certain: Sasha Johnson wasn't going to be silenced anymore. The next few days passed in a blur of frustration and determination. Sasha couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Her mind was consumed by the injustice, by the humiliation, and by the overwhelming sense that this was bigger than just one incident. It wasn't just about a flight attendant. It wasn't even just about her. It was about a system that had been ignoring issues of race for far too long. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't just let it slide. Not now. Not ever again. The airline had done nothing to address the issue beyond a bland corporate apology. No investigation, no acknowledgement of the deeper problem that the incident revealed, a culture that still tolerated racism behind the polished, friendly smiles of flight attendants and executives. No one had reached out to Sasha personally, not even a simple apology from someone higher up in the company. It was as if she had just become a footnote in a public relations nightmare. They wanted it to go away, and that angered her even more. She began reading more about discrimination in the workplace, about corporate America's failure to address systemic racism head-on. The more she read, the more she understood that this wasn't an isolated event. It was a symptom of a larger problem. People who looked like her were constantly pushed aside, dismissed, and humiliated in ways both obvious and subtle. In the corporate world, black people often had to prove themselves 10 times more than their white counterparts. Sasha had spent years in meetings, in conferences, and at corporate dinners where she had to fight for every inch of respect. But this felt different. This wasn't just about earning respect. It was about dignity, about having the right to be seen as equal. Sasha could feel her frustration turning into something sharper, something that felt like power. She didn't want to just complain about the issue. She didn't want to sit back and let the airline and the public forget about it in a few weeks. She wanted to force a conversation, a reckoning. And she realized that the best way to do that was to take the fight straight to the airline, to make them confront the issues of racism that were embedded in their culture. But she couldn't do it alone. She called Kara again. "I've been thinking about this a lot," Sasha said, her voice more determined than it had been before. "I can't just sit here and let them ignore what happened. I have to do something. But it's bigger than just filing a complaint or making a speech. I want to get the whole industry talking about this." Kara was silent for a moment before speaking. "You know what? You're right. You need to take this to the next level. If you want them to listen, you have to make them see the truth. Make them face the impact of their actions. This isn't just about one flight attendant. It's about a system that protects people like her and lets people like you and me stay at the bottom, no matter how hard we work. You can make that shift happen, Sasha. But you'll need allies." Sasha leaned back in her chair, taking a deep breath. "I know, but the thing is, the airline won't listen unless I'm in a position where they can't ignore me. They've brushed me aside, they've turned their back on this whole situation. What if I told you? What if I could lead the change?" Kara didn't respond immediately. Sasha could hear her pacing on the other end of the phone. "What are you saying?" Kara asked cautiously. "I'm saying I want to take charge of the airline's diversity and inclusion efforts. I want to lead an anti-racism initiative. Not just as an employee, but as someone in a position of authority. I want to go straight to the heart of the problem. I want to make sure that what happened to me, and what happens to so many others, isn't swept under the rug again." Kara paused. "You're serious?" Sasha smiled for the first time in days. "I'm dead serious. I'm not just going to sit here and wait for them to maybe change. I'm going to make them change. And I'm going to make sure that every single person who works there understands what racism looks like and how to fight it." Kara let out a low whistle. "Okay, now you've got me fired up. I think you can do this, but you're going to have to be strategic. You've got to play it smart. You'll need to get support from other employees, from allies, from activists. And it's going to get ugly before it gets better. But I believe in you. If anyone can shake things up, it's you." Sasha could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She had spent so many years trying to play by the rules, trying to climb the corporate ladder. But the ladder had never been built for people like her. She had seen the racism in subtle ways, the backhanded comments, the sneers from people who thought she didn't belong. Now, though, she wasn't playing the game anymore. She was going to change it. The next day, Sasha called the airline's HR department. She wasn't sure exactly what she was expecting, but she wasn't going to wait for them to come to her. She needed to make her intentions clear. She needed to take the next step. "Hello, this is Sasha Johnson," she said, her voice steady. "I'm calling about the recent incident involving one of your flight attendants. But this is bigger than just one issue. I want to help you fix the problems in your company. I want to be part of the solution." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Ma'am, we'll need to direct you to the appropriate department for a formal complaint," the receptionist said, sounding nervous. "No," Sasha cut in, her tone firm. "I'm not here to file a complaint. I'm here because I want to lead the change. I want to be part of your diversity and inclusion team, or whatever program you have. I want to help the company take real steps to address racism. I'm offering my expertise. But I'm not just going to be another name on a report. I want to lead this effort, and I want the airline to know that this is serious." There was another long pause. Then the receptionist said, "I'll pass this on to the senior team and they'll get back to you." Sasha hung up, but she didn't feel the relief she expected. This wasn't going to be easy. She could already tell it was going to be a battle, but she was prepared. She wasn't going to back down this time. This fight, the one she'd spent years avoiding, was going to be her fight now. Her decision was made. She wasn't just going to be a voice for change. She was going to lead it. And no matter how tough it got, Sasha Johnson wasn't going to stop until the airline and the entire industry was forced to reckon with the deep-seated racism that had been allowed to fester for far too long. Sasha's phone rang less than 24 hours after she made her bold call to the airline's HR department. She recognized the number immediately. It was from the corporate office. This was the moment she'd been waiting for. The call was calm, formal, almost too polite. The voice on the other end belonged to Rachel Pierce, the head of the airline's diversity and inclusion team. "Sasha, thank you for reaching out to us. We appreciate your passion for this issue," Rachel said, her tone professional but with a slight hesitation, as if unsure how to proceed. "We've been made aware of the incident you encountered, and we take your concerns seriously. We'd like to offer a meeting to discuss this further. We'll ensure that you have an opportunity to voice your concerns directly to us." Sasha wasn't sure if she was more excited or nervous. The polite, measured tone didn't give much away, but it was the first sign of acknowledgement she'd received since the incident. It was a step, but she knew this was only the beginning. She wasn't going to settle for empty promises or vague offers to talk about it. "I appreciate that, Rachel," Sasha said, her voice steady, "but I don't want to just talk about it. I want to be a part of the solution. I want to lead change. I want to be involved in creating an anti-racism program that actually does something, not just a few workshops or diversity panels that look good on paper. I want action, and I'm ready to take the lead on it." There was a long pause on the other end, followed by an uncomfortable silence. Rachel cleared her throat before responding. "Sasha, we understand your frustration, but let's be clear. The airline already has several programs in place. We've made strides toward inclusivity, and we're constantly working to improve. You've been heard, and we're committed to resolving this internally. But leadership positions in our diversity team are something we reserve for those with significant experience in corporate inclusion strategies. We may not be able to offer you a formal role at this time, but we would be happy to have you contribute in other ways." Sasha's pulse quickened, and she could feel the familiar sting of frustration rising again. It was the same thing she'd heard time and time again from corporate environments. "We're doing enough. We're improving. Just give us time." The truth was, the improvements were surface level at best. They were about optics, about appearing to do the right thing without actually changing the fundamental problems. "I understand what you're saying," Sasha replied, keeping her voice calm but firm. "But I've spent years in this industry. I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. And what I know for sure is that the culture at your airline hasn't changed. You still have people like that flight attendant, people who think they can get away with humiliating passengers because of their race. That's not going to change until you make a real commitment to confronting racism head-on. And that starts with leadership that's willing to walk the talk." Rachel's response came quickly, but it was clear she was becoming defensive. "I hear you, Sasha. But our programs are working. We have expert consultants, training initiatives, and resources in place. It's not something that happens overnight." Sasha felt the blood rising in her face, the frustration threatening to boil over. "I'm not asking for an overnight fix," she said, her voice sharper now. "I'm asking for real action. And frankly, I don't think any consultant can address the lived experience of someone who's been through this. You want change? Then give someone like me, someone who's been in the trenches, the opportunity to lead it." There was another pause, this one longer. Rachel seemed to be weighing her words carefully before speaking again. "I'll need to bring this to the attention of the executive team. They'll need to review your proposal. But I can't make any promises. Sasha didn't flinch. I don't need promises. I need commitment. The call ended shortly after, and Sasha sat in her apartment staring at her phone. The conversation had gone exactly how she expected. Corporate doublespeak, an attempt to placate her without giving her the power she was asking for. She could almost feel the walls of the airline's bureaucracy closing in around her. They didn't want change. They wanted to keep things comfortable, to maintain the status quo. They wanted her to remain an employee, not a leader. But Sasha wasn't about to back down. She wasn't here to play by their rules anymore. If they weren't going to give her the chance she deserved, then she would have to take it herself. That evening she called Kara, her voice simmering with the tension of the day. They're pushing back. They're telling me they're doing enough already, that they don't need someone like me leading this. Kara's voice was immediately sympathetic, but she didn't offer the comfort Sasha was hoping for. Of course they're pushing back. They're not going to give you the keys to the kingdom just because you ask for them. You're a threat to their entire system, but that doesn't mean you're not right. If they won't give you a seat at the table, then create your own table. Sasha smiled, though the idea was still sinking in. Create my own table. I like that, but how? You've got the experience, you've got the platform, you've got the attention. Start your own movement, Sasha. Don't wait for them to change. You make the change. You don't need their approval. Just start showing people what real leadership looks like. It hit her then. She didn't need to beg for a seat at their table. She could build her own. She didn't need the airline's permission to fight for a better, more inclusive industry. In fact, maybe it was better that way. If the company wouldn't step up, then Sasha would become the leader she wanted to see in the world. I'm going to do it, she said, her voice filled with conviction. I'm going to start my own program. I'll find the experts, the activists, the employees who are ready for real change, and I'll show them how it's done. If they won't listen, we'll make them. Kara laughed, a sound of pure encouragement. Now you're talking, and when they see how effective you are, they'll have no choice but to listen. You've got this, Sasha. Sasha hung up the phone, the plan beginning to form in her mind. She wasn't going to play their game anymore. She would create her own path, one that didn't require permission or approval. She was going to build the anti-racism initiative the airline needed, whether they liked it or not. And if they refused to recognize her authority, she would make them see her power. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. This was about changing the entire system from the inside out. She wasn't waiting for them to hand her an opportunity. She was going to make her own, and the fight for justice had only just begun. Sasha's mind was racing as she began to piece together the steps she needed to take. She wasn't going to wait for the airline to make the changes. She had seen enough of their empty promises and corporate jargon. The system was too broken to fix with a few surface-level initiatives. If they wouldn't give her a platform, then she would build one. It was time to mobilize. Her first call was to Kara. I'm not going to wait for them to do this. I'm going to take the reins. I'll create an anti-racism program, but it's going to be different, real, actionable change. I'll get employees, experts, activists, people who care about this issue. I'm going to create a movement. Kara was instantly on board. I knew you were going to say that. It's time to turn your anger into something powerful. You're not just fighting for your seat at the table anymore, you're building your own. Sasha took a deep breath and started mapping out the next steps. She needed to get the right people involved, not just people who shared her frustration, but those who had the knowledge, the expertise, and the resources to make her vision a reality. It would take time, but Sasha was used to the grind. This time, though, she wasn't doing it alone. Her first meeting was with a diversity consultant, Dr. Claire Watkins, a well-respected expert in corporate anti-racism programs. Dr. Watkins had spent years working with Fortune 500 companies to implement systemic changes in their hiring practices, employee training, and organizational culture. Sasha knew that she couldn't afford to get this wrong, so she sought out the best. When they met in a small coffee shop, Dr. Watkins listened intently as Sasha explained her vision for a company-wide anti-racism initiative, one that didn't just focus on diversity hiring or sensitivity training, but also on dismantling the everyday microaggressions, biases, and systemic inequalities that persisted in the workplace. "Your approach is bold," Dr. Watkins said, sipping her coffee, "but it's necessary. This kind of movement needs support from the top down, and it needs to be built into every part of the organization, not just as a standalone program." "I agree," Sasha responded, her voice steady. "I want this to go beyond just the flight attendants and staff. I want this to influence the entire company culture, from the top executives to the entry-level employees. We need to create a space where everyone feels safe, where the organization acknowledges its own biases and works to change them." Dr. Watkins nodded. "It's going to be tough, Sasha. You're fighting an entrenched system, one that doesn't like to be called out, especially when it comes to racism. But I'm in. I'll help you build this program." With Dr. Watkins on board, Sasha set her sights on recruiting others, employees from different departments who had witnessed or experienced racism firsthand, activists who had been fighting this battle for years, and even some former colleagues who had left the airline because of the toxic culture. She reached out through social media, creating a quiet buzz about the program she was about to launch. The response was overwhelming. People were ready for change. Messages flooded in. Former flight attendants, engineers, pilots, and customer service agents. They all had stories to tell, and they all wanted to be part of a movement that could make a real difference. As the weeks passed, Sasha began assembling her team, a mix of experienced professionals, passionate activists, and everyday employees who felt the weight of the issue every day. They held secret meetings in local cafes, community centers, and quiet office spaces, working on strategy, researching best practices, and drafting a framework for the program that would soon challenge the airline's entrenched culture. They weren't just creating a program, they were building a revolution. But despite the growing momentum, Sasha knew they were still up against powerful opposition. The higher-ups at the airline had started to notice the ripple effect. Some of the key employees who were sympathetic to her cause had started to ask questions about the program. Could they really risk being associated with someone like Sasha Johnson, someone who had been so publicly critical of the company? But Sasha wasn't afraid of their power anymore. She was moving beyond their walls. She didn't need their permission. She was creating a new path. The time for waiting was over. It was time to make this movement official. Sasha called a press conference. The day of the press conference arrived, and Sasha could feel the weight of what she was about to do. This wasn't just another protest, another social media post. This was the moment when she would publicly challenge the airline and expose their lack of real commitment to anti-racism. The stakes were higher than ever, but she knew she couldn't back down. The event was held in a small downtown conference room. Sasha had arranged for a select group of journalists, those who had covered her story previously, and others she had personally reached out to. There were a few cameras set up in the corner, and the buzz in the room was palpable. People were here for one thing: to hear what Sasha Johnson had to say. She stood at the front of the room, her posture straight, her heart pounding in her chest. Behind her, the banner for her new initiative was prominently displayed. Racial Equity in Aviation, Moving Beyond the Surface. It wasn't just about one woman getting her seat at the table. It was about dismantling the very structures that had kept people like her from succeeding in the industry. When the crowd quieted, Sasha stepped forward, her voice cutting through the room. "Thank you all for coming. I've called this press conference today because the airline industry is at a crossroads. We're all aware of the stories, of the racism that still runs rampant in many companies. But in the airline industry, these issues are not just outliers. They are embedded in the culture, in the systems, and in the daily interactions of employees and passengers alike." She paused for a moment, looking around at the faces in the room. Some were skeptical, some intrigued, but all were listening. "I am here to announce the creation of a new initiative, an initiative designed to address these issues head-on. Racial Equity in Aviation is a movement, a commitment to creating a truly inclusive industry, one that goes beyond token gestures and diversity quotas. We are calling for the creation of anti-racism programs at every level of the organization, from leadership to frontline workers. We demand accountability, transparency, and most importantly, we demand change. The room was silent for a beat, and then a few murmurs of agreement spread through the crowd. Sasha continued, her voice gaining strength. I am here to challenge the status quo, to challenge the idea that diversity and inclusion are just buzzwords to be thrown around in meetings or PR campaigns. We are going to create real programs that tackle microaggressions, implicit bias, and systemic barriers. We are going to make sure that the airline industry is a place where everyone, regardless of race, gender, or background, can thrive. But we can't do it alone. We need allies. We need people who are willing to stand up for what is right, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it's inconvenient. At that moment, Sasha felt the power of the crowd shift. People were no longer just watching her. They were listening, truly listening, to what she was saying. For the first time since the incident, she felt like she was no longer fighting alone. She had created a movement, and it was bigger than one person. It was about all of them. Today, we take the first step toward real change, Sasha said, her voice rising. The airline industry cannot continue to ignore this issue. It's time for us to do better. It's time for us to lead. The room erupted into applause. Sasha didn't know what would come next, but one thing was clear. The movement had started, and the airline, whether they liked it or not, was going to have to reckon with it. The press conference was a whirlwind of activity. Within hours, headlines about Sasha's bold announcement were plastered across newspapers, websites, and social media platforms. The story exploded in the public eye. She wasn't just another disgruntled former employee. She was now the face of a movement, and that movement was shaking the very foundation of the airline industry. At first, the company tried to downplay the story. They issued a brief corporate-sounding statement, claiming they had always been committed to diversity and inclusion, and that they supported efforts to address discrimination wherever it occurred. But the words felt hollow, a clear attempt to avoid taking any real responsibility. The public wasn't buying it. Social media was flooded with reactions. Supporters of Sasha's cause, other passengers sharing their own experiences of racism in the airline industry, and activists rallying behind her. Behind closed doors, the airline's executive team was in crisis mode. Sasha's press conference had struck a nerve, and they knew it. Board members huddled in emergency meetings, frantically trying to figure out how to respond. The last thing they wanted was a scandal that could jeopardize their brand, especially with the public's growing demand for accountability. Sasha's phone rang again, this time from Rachel Pierce, the head of the airline's diversity and inclusion team. Sasha answered, her voice steady but sharp, knowing exactly what was coming. Sasha, we need to talk, Rachel said, her tone tight. This isn't the way we expected things to unfold. Your announcement, it's causing quite a stir. Sasha didn't flinch. I know it is. It's meant to. You can't hide behind PR statements anymore. The culture in your company is broken, and now everyone knows it. There was a long silence on the other end before Rachel responded, We're committed to resolving this. We've arranged a meeting with the executive team to discuss next steps. But I need to warn you, this is going to be a delicate process. You've gone public in a way that leaves little room for negotiation. I'm not negotiating, Sasha replied, her voice firm. I'm not here for empty promises. I want action, and I want leadership. If you're serious about change, you'll give me a seat at the table, not just as a contributor, but as a leader of this initiative. No more corporate buzzwords, no more excuses. Rachel hesitated. I understand your frustration, but we need to find a way to work together on this. Sasha cut her off. There's no working together until you recognize that this issue is much bigger than a department. This is about changing the entire culture. It's not going to be a quick fix. So if you want to be part of this, you need to be ready to make some real changes. The conversation ended shortly after, with no concrete promises, just the vague promise of a discussion with the top executives. Sasha didn't expect anything else. She knew the game. This wasn't about her, not in their eyes. It was about protecting their image and avoiding a public backlash. That night, as Sasha sat alone in her apartment, the weight of what she had started began to sink in. She was now fully in the spotlight, and the pressure was mounting. She had no idea how this would play out, but there was no turning back. The airline had been forced to reckon with the reality of their racism, but now, the real battle would begin. The next day, the first wave of pushback arrived. Sasha was bombarded with messages from current and former employees who had heard rumors about her campaign. Some were supportive, saying they'd been waiting for someone to speak out, but others were more cautious. A few employees, especially those in senior positions, warned her about the potential consequences. "You've crossed a line," one of them wrote. "Be careful. The company won't forgive you for this." The anonymous threats were even more unsettling. Sasha had heard the whispers before, about how companies sometimes try to silence those who make waves. She wasn't naive. She knew that speaking out like this could jeopardize her career. But what was her career worth if it meant continuing to be complicit in a system that allowed this kind of behavior to persist? It wasn't just a job. It was her integrity, her sense of justice. She couldn't back down now. The following morning, Sasha's inbox was flooded with offers for interviews, appearances, and speaking engagements. Media outlets were eager to have her on, but not all of them had the same intentions. Some wanted her to backtrack, to apologize, to settle down before things got worse. Others were genuinely interested in hearing her story. It was a delicate balance. Sasha knew that how she handled the next few weeks would define whether this movement would grow or fizzle out. But just as she was getting a handle on everything, an unexpected twist came her way. A source within the airline, someone she had worked with closely during her time there, reached out to her. "I have something you need to see," the message read. "Something that could change everything." Sasha's curiosity piqued. She agreed to meet. The rendezvous was set at a small, quiet diner downtown. When she sat down with her contact, the person slid a folder across the table. Inside were internal documents, memos, emails, and meeting notes. They all pointed to something disturbing. A long history of ignored complaints, discrimination, and even internal discussions about keeping quiet when racism incidents came up. "This isn't just about a rogue flight attendant," the source said, voice barely above a whisper. "This is about a culture of silence. They've been covering this up for years." Sasha felt a chill run through her. The documents were like a damning blueprint of the airline's failure to address systemic racism. These weren't just isolated cases. They were a pattern of behavior that had been ignored at every level, from entry-level staff to executives. The company had been operating under the assumption that if they didn't acknowledge the problem, it would simply go away. Now Sasha had everything she needed, but she also knew this was a risk. Publishing these documents would put her in direct conflict with the airline's leadership. It could mean a legal battle, and perhaps even a PR nightmare. But as she read through the papers, the weight of her decision became clear. This was not just about a fight for leadership. This was about exposing the truth. If she could take this evidence public, she could force the airline into a corner, make them address the deep-seated issues that had been festering for years. Sasha closed the folder, her mind made up. "Thank you," she said quietly, looking up at her contact. "This changes everything." As she left the diner, the world outside seemed different. She wasn't just fighting to be heard anymore. She was fighting to bring the truth to light, and she was ready to take this fight as far as it needed to go, no matter what. The following day, Sasha prepared herself for the inevitable firestorm. She knew what she had was explosive. The internal documents exposed years of systemic racism within the airline. Hidden behind the polished facade of diversity initiatives and vague corporate statements. This wasn't just a case of one bad flight attendant. It was a culture of silence, of ignoring complaints, of protecting those who perpetuated racial discrimination. Sasha could feel the weight of the decision as she went over the files one last time. The truth needed to come out. She'd been briefed on the legal risks, of course. Publishing this information would open her up to lawsuits, potential defamation charges, and could permanently damage her professional reputation. But Sasha wasn't scared of what might happen to her personally. What terrified her was the thought of letting the airline continue to get away with this. The public deserved to know the truth, and it wasn't just about her fight anymore. It was about everyone who had ever suffered because of these entrenched systems. She called a press conference for the following week. This time, however, it wasn't just about her platform. It was about giving voice to the people who had been silenced for so long. She invited activists, former employees, and people who had been victims of racial discrimination within the airline industry to speak alongside her. She wanted the world to see that this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, and this time, they wouldn't be silenced. When the press conference day arrived, the atmosphere was tense. The cameras were all rolling, and the room was filled with reporters eager to hear the next big revelation. Sasha stepped to the podium, her voice steady but her heart racing. "I'm here today because the truth has to come out," she began, her gaze unwavering. "For too long, the airline industry, including the company I once worked for, has ignored the reality of racial discrimination. Behind every story of a passenger who's mistreated, behind every flight attendant who's had to face microaggressions from colleagues, there's a pattern, and today I'm here to expose that pattern." Sasha opened the folder in front of her and began to slowly, deliberately read from the documents. The emails, memos, and internal reports detailed countless complaints about racism, some of them decades old, many of them brushed aside or outright ignored. She described how complaints from black employees about racial profiling, unequal treatment, and bullying were dismissed as misunderstandings or isolated incidents. Some of the reports even contained language about maintaining a positive public image at all costs, at the expense of truth. "There are emails here," Sasha continued, "where executives were told about racism within the company. They didn't act. Instead, they allowed the toxic environment to persist, and worse, they actively sought to cover it up. They cared more about their brand than about the people who worked for them." The room was dead silent as Sasha's words sank in. There was no hiding from the evidence. Sasha wasn't just telling her story anymore, she was exposing a corporate cover-up that spanned years. As she continued, she could feel the energy in the room shift. Some reporters were scribbling notes furiously, while others exchanged glances, realizing the magnitude of what they were hearing. Sasha wasn't just a whistleblower, she was a force. When she finished reading, she took a deep breath and closed the folder. "This is the reality of the airline industry. I'm not here to play politics. I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to demand action. We need a complete overhaul of the way this company, and this industry, deals with racism, and we're not going to stop until it happens." The room erupted into questions, but Sasha didn't flinch. She was ready. She had anticipated the pushback. One reporter raised his hand, his voice skeptical. "How do you respond to those who say you're attacking an entire industry based on your own personal experience? They'll say you're trying to damage the reputation of the airline. What's your response to that?" Sasha met his gaze. "I'm not attacking the industry. I'm holding it accountable, and if the airline has nothing to hide, then they won't be afraid of the truth. I'm not here to destroy the company, I'm here to rebuild it. But only if they're willing to confront what's been swept under the rug for far too long." Another reporter asked, "What happens if they don't listen? What will you do next?" Sasha's eyes flashed with resolve. "I'm not going anywhere. This is just the beginning. If the airline refuses to act, then I will continue to bring these issues to light. I'll work with the employees, the victims, the activists, and we'll create the change this industry so desperately needs. I'll hold them accountable every step of the way, and I won't stop until they do what's right." The press conference ended with a flurry of cameras flashing and reporters scrambling to get the next big story. But Sasha wasn't thinking about the headlines. She was thinking about what came next. She had just thrown down the gauntlet. And now, she was ready for the fight. It didn't take long for the backlash to hit. Within hours, the airline's public relations team issued a statement denouncing Sasha's claims, calling the documents unsubstantiated and claiming that they were taken out of context. They asserted that the company had long-standing policies in place to address discrimination and that any incident of racism was isolated and would be investigated. But Sasha knew these statements were just the same old rhetoric, the same tired defense they had always used to deflect responsibility. The PR damage control began in full force. Corporate spokespeople were sent out on every major news network to give their side of the story. Executives from the airline spoke with calm, rehearsed voices, dismissing Sasha's allegations and assuring the public that the company was committed to diversity and inclusion. They even released a glossy new campaign promising to do better. But it was all smoke and mirrors, designed to placate the public, not to actually address the deep-seated issues. In the days that followed, Sasha received a flurry of calls from her legal team. The airline was threatening to sue her for defamation, claiming that the leaked documents were illegally obtained. They wanted to silence her, to discredit her before her movement could gain any real momentum. But Sasha wasn't afraid of their threats. She had already anticipated this. "What are we going to do?" Kara asked when she called to check in on her. "They're coming after you hard." Sasha wasn't shaken. "Let them. They can sue me, they can try to discredit me, but they can't change the truth. I've already won. The public knows what's going on. We're not backing down. This is bigger than any lawsuit they can throw at me." But the pressure was building. The airline's retaliation wasn't just in the form of legal threats. It was also personal. Sasha's social media accounts were flooded with negative comments, some from people who worked at the airline, others from trolls sent to intimidate her. Her inbox was full of threatening messages, some more hostile than others. "You'll regret this," one email read. "You're destroying lives. You'll never work in this industry again." It wasn't just online. Sasha started receiving anonymous phone calls at her apartment. At first it was just hang-ups. But soon, the messages became more explicit. "You've made a big mistake, Sasha," one man's voice said in a deep guttural tone. "You won't be able to hide from us forever." Her heart raced as she hung up, but she didn't let the fear take hold. She knew that fear was exactly what the airline wanted. They wanted her to back down, to be intimidated into silence. But Sasha wasn't going to be silenced. She had a responsibility to see this through, and she wasn't going anywhere. She sat down with her team that night, outlining the next steps. "We keep going," she said firmly. "We don't back down. We use this to fuel the movement. If they think they can intimidate me into silence, they're wrong." The fight was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. The stakes had been raised, and Sasha was ready to meet them head-on. The retaliation from the airline only made Sasha more determined. If anything, it validated her cause. It proved that the company had something to hide, and they would do anything to protect their image, even if it meant targeting her personally. But the pushback also had an unintended effect. The public, especially on social media, began to rally behind Sasha in droves. The more the airline tried to discredit her, the more people saw it as a fight for justice. It was as if the world was finally waking up to the systemic issues that Sasha had been screaming about for years. A hashtag began to trend. #racism in the skies #. People from all over the world shared their own stories of racial discrimination in the airline industry, from unfair treatment at check-in counters to microaggressions on flights. Some passengers even shared personal experiences of how flight attendants had treated them differently based on the color of their skin. It was a tidal wave of support and shared experiences. The hashtag racism in the skies hashtag quickly went viral, picking up steam in ways that no one had anticipated. Social media users, from activists to celebrities, began to lend their voices to the cause. It wasn't just Sasha's fight anymore. It had become a global movement. News outlets began to pick up on the story, and soon, the airline was under the kind of scrutiny they had never faced before. Sasha's legal team was busy fielding phone calls and strategizing with her about the next steps. The defamation lawsuit was coming, that much was clear. But the more the airline went after her, the more the public rallied behind her. She knew she had the upper hand now. The truth was out there, and it wasn't going back in the bottle. But then something unexpected happened. A former executive from the airline reached out to Sasha. His name was Samuel Jacobs, and he had been with the company for over 20 years before he resigned in frustration over the lack of real change regarding diversity and inclusion. He'd been watching the fallout from his quiet retirement, and something in Sasha's fight had moved him. "I've been following your story, Sasha," Samuel said during their first conversation, "and I've seen this kind of thing happen for years. You're not just fighting a few bad apples, you're fighting an entire culture. I've got documents, emails, proof that goes right to the top. I want to help you." Sasha's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't just hearing from anyone. Samuel Jacobs had once been one of the top decision-makers at the airline. His insider knowledge could be exactly what she needed to take the fight to the next level. "I don't know if this will be enough, but it's all I've got," Samuel continued. "I'll send everything I have to you, no strings attached. If this is going to change, it needs to start with the truth, and it needs to come from someone on the inside." Samuel wasn't just giving her documents, he was giving her a roadmap to the airline's deepest secrets. With this new evidence, Sasha felt an overwhelming sense of resolve. She wasn't just a whistleblower now, she was a force with undeniable evidence, a voice for the voiceless in a battle against one of the largest corporations in the world. With Samuel's files in hand, Sasha knew the moment had come. She couldn't just let this sit. This was her opportunity to expose the depth of the airline's systemic racism once and for all. The documents Samuel had provided were far more damning than anything she had previously uncovered. Emails showed high-level executives actively shutting down complaints about discrimination, worried about the financial repercussions of making it public. There were internal memos that referred to keeping minority employees happy without actually addressing the root issues of bias, and worse, some documents openly discussed protecting certain executives from public backlash over past racist incidents. The proof was undeniable. Sasha called another press conference, but this time, it wasn't just about her. It wasn't even just about the airline's failure to take action. This was bigger. It was about all the employees, all the passengers who had suffered in silence, who had been ignored for years. She wasn't going to hold back any longer. She was going to use everything she had, the documents, the stories, the support of those who had joined her movement, to make the airline answer for its actions. "I've given the airline every chance to do the right thing," she began when she stood before the cameras once again, a confident fire in her eyes. "And they've failed at every turn. They've failed their employees, they've failed their passengers, and they've failed themselves. They've let a culture of racism fester for years, and they've ignored the voices that were calling for change." She held up the folder of documents that Samuel had sent her. The weight of them seemed symbolic in her hand. This wasn't just paperwork. This was history, the history of the airline's refusal to change, to admit its faults, to address the systemic racism that had long been woven into the fabric of its operations. "You're looking at proof of cover-ups, of internal memos where the leadership actively worked to hide racism to protect their image. You're looking at years of people's lives being affected because the system was too afraid to admit that it was broken." Sasha paused to let the gravity of her words settle in. "Today, I'm here to tell you that I won't stop until the airline makes real changes. This is no longer about me. It's about all of us. It's about every employee who's been discriminated against, every passenger who's faced prejudice, every black woman who's been made to feel less than in this industry. We're not just asking for change anymore, we're demanding it." As she spoke, Sasha noticed a shift. The public was no longer just interested in the story, they were becoming a part of it. The movement was gaining traction faster than anyone had anticipated. Celebrities, politicians, and even other corporations began speaking out in support of Sasha's cause. It was clear now that the tide had turned. The public was no longer on the airline's side. They were on hers. But as the pressure mounted on the airline's executives, they realized they had no choice but to respond. The company issued an official statement acknowledging the allegations and promising to take swift and decisive action. They announced an internal investigation, as well as a commitment to overhaul their diversity and inclusion programs. But Sasha wasn't fooled. This was damage control. They weren't committing to real change. They were committing to looking like they were changing. Sasha wasn't interested in their public relations tactics anymore. She had already seen through the mask. The time for empty promises was over. She wasn't going to wait for the company to change. She had made it clear in every interview, in every statement. She would be the one leading the charge. The next day, Sasha released a bold statement. "I appreciate the airline's acknowledgement of the issue, but this is just the beginning. They can't buy their way out of this with another training program or a new logo. They need to take accountability for the harm they've caused. And I will be here, every step of the way, to ensure they do." Sasha's position was clear. The fight was far from over, and now it wasn't just about her career or even the airline. It was about the future of the industry. Change had come, whether they liked it or not. The question was no longer if they would change, but how. And Sasha knew exactly how. She would make them face the truth, no matter what it took. Despite the mounting public pressure, the airline was still resistant to real change. Behind the scenes, the executives were scrambling to protect their bottom line. They hired top consultants to analyze how they could better manage the crisis, while privately blaming the media for blowing things out of proportion. But it was clear to anyone paying attention that the company was in deep trouble. Sasha watched as the airline's attempts at damage control grew more desperate. They rolled out diversity training programs, revamped their internal policies on discrimination, and even promised to make leadership changes. But to Sasha, it was all just smoke and mirrors. She wasn't fooled by their empty gestures. She knew that real change would require more than just policies. It would require a fundamental shift in the way the company operated, the way it viewed its employees, and the way it interacted with the public. The leadership had to be held accountable, and that meant not just admitting the past mistakes, but taking active steps to correct them. Meanwhile, inside the company, whispers about Sasha's campaign had begun to divide the staff. Some employees rallied behind her, sharing their own stories of discrimination, even offering to join her efforts. They were tired of the culture of silence, of being forced to pretend that everything was fine when they knew better. But others, particularly those in upper management, were less enthusiastic. Some were openly hostile, accusing Sasha of trying to destroy the company. "She's just bitter," one manager said, speaking in hushed tones. "She's out for revenge." But Sasha wasn't interested in their accusations. She knew her fight wasn't just about her personal experience. It was about the collective experience of so many others who had suffered in silence for far too long. It wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. And she would do whatever it took to make sure that the truth came out and that the airline was held accountable for its actions. The tension inside the airline was palpable, but it wasn't just the executives who were feeling the heat, it was the employees too. Some were finding it difficult to navigate the growing divide between those who supported Sasha's cause and those who felt threatened by it. Some flight attendants came forward to speak about the culture of discrimination they had faced, while others chose to stay silent, fearing repercussions for speaking out. Sasha knew the stakes were high, but she also knew that the change she was advocating for couldn't be achieved by standing on the sidelines. It had to be fought for, every single day. The turning point came when the airline was forced to respond more directly to the growing movement. After weeks of bad press and mounting protests, they finally agreed to meet with Sasha in a formal, closed-door meeting. It was a tense, high-stakes conversation, with representatives from the airline's top executives seated across from Sasha and her legal team. Sasha wasn't intimidated. She had seen this company's playbook before: denial, deflection, and empty promises. This time, she wasn't going to let them get away with it. The meeting began with the usual corporate talk. They apologized for the isolated incidents of discrimination, assured Sasha that they were committed to diversity, and promised they would be working with external consultants to improve things. But Sasha had heard it all before. "I'm not here for a public relations stunt," Sasha said, cutting through the pleasantries. "You've had years to fix this. You've had countless reports, complaints, and incidents to address this issue. But instead, you've hidden it, swept it under the rug. You've protected the people who caused harm, and you've let the culture of racism continue. If you want to be part of the solution, you need to start by taking responsibility. I'm not interested in more training programs or initiatives. I'm here to talk about real change." The executives were taken aback, but Sasha didn't give them a chance to deflect. She laid out a clear, non-negotiable plan. She wanted the creation of a permanent internal task force to oversee the airline's anti-racism efforts. This task force would be made up of both external experts and current employees, and it would be led by someone with the authority to implement real change. No more tokenism, no more empty promises. But it wasn't just about leadership. It was about the employees. Sasha demanded that the airline offer whistleblower protections for employees who spoke out about racial discrimination, and that they set up anonymous reporting channels where employees could safely report incidents without fear of retaliation. She also made it clear that there needed to be public accountability, an independent audit of the airline's past and present diversity efforts, and a public report outlining the steps they would take to address systemic racism. It was bold, it was aggressive, and it was exactly what the airline needed. The executives sat in stunned silence for a moment. But Sasha wasn't waiting for their approval. She had made her demands clear. "You don't get to control the narrative anymore," she said firmly. "The world is watching, the employees are watching, and if you want to keep your customers, you need to show that you're serious about this. Not tomorrow, not next year. Now." Finally, after a long pause, the airline's chief executive spoke up. "We hear you, Sasha. We will meet your demands. We will form the task force, and we will make the changes you've outlined. We will work to implement them as quickly as possible." It wasn't a perfect victory. It never would be. But it was the first real step toward the change Sasha had been fighting for. She knew the road ahead would be long, and the work far from done. But for the first time in months, she felt like her efforts had been validated. This wasn't just a public relations response. It was a real commitment to change, and Sasha had won the first battle. 1 year later, the airline's transformation was visible, though it wasn't without its struggles. The task force Sasha had demanded was in full operation, with a diverse group of employees and experts from outside the company working together to ensure that the airline's anti-racism efforts were meaningful. New reporting systems had been implemented, and employees were now empowered to speak out without fear of retaliation. Sasha's leadership had made a tangible difference, and her reputation as a tireless advocate for justice had grown even stronger. But the real change was in the company culture. Employees no longer felt forced to hide their experiences of discrimination. They felt seen, heard, and respected. The company wasn't perfect, but it was on the right path. And that, Sasha knew, was just the beginning. It wasn't just about corporate change, it was about shifting the entire narrative. Sasha was now heading the airline's anti-racism program, a role she had never imagined herself in just a year earlier. But here she was, leading the charge, not just for herself, but for every person who had ever felt the sting of racism in a world that too often turned a blind eye. In an interview with a major news outlet, Sasha reflected on her journey. "It wasn't easy," she said, her voice steady and filled with conviction. "I had to stand up when no one else would. I had to challenge an entire system that was built on discrimination. But that's what change takes. It takes courage, it takes action, and it takes leadership. And it's not just about changing a company, it's about changing the world." Sasha's fight wasn't over. The battle for racial equality was far from finished. But with each step, Each victory, each person who found their voice, the world was inching closer to the change it needed. And Sasha would continue to lead, to fight, and to demand that every person, regardless of the color of their skin, was treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. Her journey had come full circle, from a victim of racism to the head of an industry-wide movement. And now, Sasha was leading the charge to ensure that the skies, once tainted by prejudice, would be a place of equality, respect, and justice for all. The story of Sasha's fight against racism within the airline industry teaches us that change begins with courage, persistence, and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Even in the face of personal adversity, standing up for what's right, especially when no one else will, can have a profound impact. It reminds us that real change requires more than just words or promises. It demands action, accountability, and a willingness to dismantle systems of injustice. Sasha's journey shows that standing up for the oppressed, speaking out against injustice, and demanding accountability can inspire others to do the same, sparking movements that can transform entire industries. The lesson is clear. One voice, no matter how small it seems, can lead to the change the world so desperately needs. By persevering in the face of fear and resistance, we can all be part of the solution, shaping a future where everyone is treated with dignity, respect, and equality. In the end, it's not just about fighting for yourself. It's about fighting for everyone who's been silenced, overlooked, or oppressed. And the journey toward justice, while difficult, is always worth it.